The Arab Spring, a wave of pro-democracy uprisings, swept across North Africa and the Middle East in late 2010. Beginning in Tunisia, the movement quickly spread to Egypt, igniting long-suppressed desires for freedom and political change. Libya, under Muammar Gaddafi's iron-fisted rule for over 4 decades, was ripe for upheaval. Gaddafi's regime, notorious for its brutality and suppression of dissent, faced growing resentment from a population yearning for basic rights and freedoms. The Libyan people, inspired by the successes in neighboring countries, dared to challenge Gaddafi's authority. What began as peaceful protests in Benghazi, Libya's second-largest city, rapidly escalated into a full-blown armed rebellion. The regime's brutal crackdown on demonstrators, using live ammunition against unarmed civilians, only fueled the flames of resistance. The world watched in horror as images of violence and repression emerged from Libya, a stark reminder of the regime's ruthlessness. The Libyan uprising, though fueled by the same yearning for freedom as other Arab Spring movements, quickly took on a different character. Muammar Gaddafi seized power in a bloodless coup in 1969, overthrowing the monarchy and establishing the Libyan Arab Republic. Gaddafi implemented social programs, improved literacy rates, and invested in infrastructure, but his regime was also marked by authoritarianism and human rights abuses. He abolished political parties, banned independent media, and ruthlessly crushed any form of dissent. By the early 2000s, cracks began to appear in Gaddafi's regime. Despite Libya's oil wealth, much of the population suffered from poverty and unemployment. Gaddafi's erratic behavior on the international stage, his support for terrorist groups, and his brutal crackdown on dissent led to international isolation and sanctions. The growing discontent, and the regime's weakening control, created a fertile ground for the Arab Spring uprisings to take root. When protests erupted in Tunisia and Egypt, Libyans, particularly the younger generation, took to social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter to express their frustrations and call for change. The Libyan uprising began in mid-February 2011, ignited by a call for protests on February 17, later dubbed the Day of Rage. The protests, inspired by the successful uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, were organized primarily through social media, reflecting the growing frustration of a population yearning for freedom and change. The regime's response was swift and brutal, with security forces using tear gas, water cannons, and live ammunition to disperse protesters. The city of Benghazi, known for its independent spirit and history of resistance to Gaddafi's rule, became the epicenter of the uprising. Protesters clashed with security forces, seizing control of parts of the city. The regime's violence only fueled the flames of rebellion, pushing more people to join the opposition. What began as peaceful demonstrations quickly transformed into an armed insurgency, with defectors from the Libyan army joining the ranks of the rebels. The rebels, a disparate group of students, professionals, former military officers, and ordinary citizens, united by their opposition to Gaddafi, formed the National Transitional Council, NTC. As the conflict in Libya escalated, with Gaddafi's forces bearing down on rebel-held cities, the international community faced a critical decision: to intervene or not to intervene. The Arab League, in an unprecedented move, called for a no-fly zone over Libya to protect civilians from Gaddafi's air force. On March 17, 2011, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973, authorizing all necessary measures to protect civilians in Libya. The resolution paved the way for a NATO-led military intervention. France, the United Kingdom, and the United States played a leading role in the intervention, launching airstrikes against Gaddafi's military targets. NATO airstrikes significantly weakened Gaddafi's military capabilities, preventing a massacre of civilians in Benghazi and other rebel-held cities. The intervention, however, also had unintended consequences. It prolonged the conflict, leading to further destruction and loss of life. The Libyan intervention sparked a debate about the responsibility to protect, R2P, a doctrine that emphasizes the international community's obligation to prevent genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. With NATO airstrikes weakening Gaddafi's forces and bolstering the rebels' capabilities, the tide of the conflict began to turn decisively in favor of the opposition. The rebels, emboldened by NATO's support and Gaddafi's dwindling resources, launched a series of offensives, gradually gaining control of key cities and towns. In August 2011, rebel forces launched a decisive offensive on Tripoli, Gaddafi's stronghold, and the capital of Libya. The battle for Tripoli was fierce and bloody, but the rebels, aided by NATO airstrikes and popular uprisings within the city, eventually prevailed. Gaddafi's regime crumbled, with many of his officials and loyalists fleeing or defecting to the rebel side. Gaddafi, forced into hiding as his regime disintegrated around him, vowed to fight to the death. However, his capture in his hometown of Sirte in October 2011 marked the symbolic end of his 42-year rule. The fall of Tripoli and Gaddafi's death triggered scenes of jubilation across Libya, as people celebrated the end of a brutal regime and the prospect of a new era of freedom and democracy. The 2011 Libyan conflict, while ultimately leading to the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi's regime, came at a heavy price. The conflict claimed the lives of thousands of Libyans, both combatants and civilians caught in the crossfire. The United Nations estimated that over 20,000 people were killed during the uprising and the ensuing civil war. The conflict also resulted in widespread displacement, with hundreds of thousands of Libyans forced to flee their homes. Many sought refuge in neighboring countries like Tunisia and Egypt, while others were internally displaced within Libya. The exodus of refugees strained the resources of host countries and created a humanitarian crisis within Libya, as displaced families struggled to access basic necessities like food, water, and shelter. The trauma of violence, loss, and displacement continues to haunt many Libyans, particularly children who witnessed atrocities or lost loved ones during the conflict. The overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi's regime created a power vacuum in Libya, leaving a void that was quickly filled by a multitude of armed groups, militias, and political factions vying for influence and control. The lack of strong national institutions, a legacy of Gaddafi's deliberate dismantling of state structures, exacerbated the challenges of transition. The absence of a unified army or police force made it difficult to maintain order, disarm militias, and establish security. The political landscape became increasingly fragmented, with rival political parties and alliances forming and dissolving, each pursuing its own narrow interests. The National Transitional Council, NTC, the interim government formed during the uprising, struggled to assert its authority and manage the country's complex transition. Elections, held in 2012, brought to power a General National Congress, GNC, but it too proved unable to bridge deep political divides or address the country's myriad challenges. The failure of successive governments to establish a monopoly on the use of force allowed militias to flourish. In the aftermath of the 2011 revolution, Libya witnessed a proliferation of militias, each vying for power and influence in the absence of a strong central authority. These militias, often with fluid allegiances and shifting objectives, exploited the security vacuum, engaging in criminal activities, human rights abuses, and inter-militia fighting. The militias, often operating with impunity, became deeply entrenched in the country's social, economic, and political fabric. They controlled key infrastructure, including oil fields and ports, using their military power to extract revenue and enrich their commanders. The militias' dominance hindered the establishment of a functioning state, as they resisted attempts to disarm and integrate them into a national army or police force. The rise of militias plunged Libya into a cycle of violence and instability. Clashes between rival militias, often triggered by disputes over territory, resources, or political influence, became a regular occurrence. The international community, initially focused on supporting Libya's political transition, struggled to address the growing challenge posed by militias. The 2011 Libyan conflict and its tumultuous aftermath had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond Libya's borders, impacting regional stability, international security, and global migration patterns. The collapse of Libya, once a relatively stable country under Gaddafi's iron-fisted rule, created a security vacuum in North Africa, with ripple effects felt across the Sahel region and beyond. The conflict triggered a massive refugee crisis, as hundreds of thousands of Libyans fled the violence and instability, seeking refuge in neighboring countries, particularly Tunisia and Egypt. The influx of refugees strained the resources of host countries, already grappling with their own economic and political challenges. The proliferation of weapons looted from Gaddafi's vast arsenals, including small arms, heavy weaponry and even surface-to-air missiles destabilized the entire Sahel region. These weapons flowed across porous borders, ending up in the hands of armed groups, terrorists, and criminal networks. The Sahel, already grappling with poverty, drought, and weak governance, became a hotbed of instability, with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQM, exploiting the chaos to expand their influence and carry out attacks. A decade after the 2011 uprising that toppled Muammar Gaddafi, Libya remains mired in a complex web of political, economic, and security challenges, a stark testament to the enduring legacy of conflict and the arduous path to peace and stability. The hopes for a democratic and prosperous Libya, ignited by the revolution, have been dashed by years of political infighting, militia rule, and foreign interference. The country remains politically divided, with two rival governments vying for legitimacy and control. The internationally recognized Government of National Accord, GNA, based in Tripoli, and the Libyan National Army, LNA, led by Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar and based in eastern Libya, have been locked in a protracted power struggle, further fragmenting the country and hindering efforts at reconciliation. The economy, heavily reliant on oil exports, has been devastated by years of conflict and instability. Oil production, the lifeblood of the Libyan economy, has been repeatedly disrupted by blockades, attacks on infrastructure, and political disputes. The lack of economic opportunities, widespread corruption, and a crumbling infrastructure have fueled frustration and discontent, particularly among the youth who bore the brunt of the revolution. The 2011 Libyan conflict, initially hailed as a triumph for democracy and freedom, has left behind a legacy of instability, division, and shattered dreams. The overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi's regime, while ending decades of authoritarian rule, ushered in an era of uncertainty and turmoil, marked by political fragmentation, militia dominance, and a devastating civil war. The hopes for a democratic and prosperous Libya, ignited by the revolution, remain elusive, as the country grapples with the daunting challenges of rebuilding a shattered nation. The Libyan conflict serves as a cautionary tale about the complexities of intervention, the challenges of post-conflict reconstruction, and the enduring legacy of violence. The international community's intervention, while credited with preventing a humanitarian catastrophe, also contributed to the fragmentation of the country and the proliferation of militias. The future of Libya remains uncertain. The country stands at a crossroads, facing a choice between continued conflict and instability, or a path towards reconciliation, reconstruction, and sustainable peace.